Okay, fine, thank you. Welcome everyone to the continuing webinar series of LERA. And this particular webinar is one that the International and Comparative section of LERA organized, which explains some of the participants. I won't go over the speakers, each one will come on and you will see them. But let me just cover the fact that the focus of this particular webinar is how governments, employers, and trade unions in different countries have responded to the impact of COVID-19 on workers. So it's a very public policy focus of this webinar. And I thank everybody who is participating, both as listening to us and the speakers and those who helped organize it. First, let me tell everyone that this session is being recorded. So let people know if something is off the record, or else be discreet in what you say if you don't want something recorded. The second thing is you will be listening, those in the audience, so you have to click on the participant icon, which would pop up at the bottom of your screen if you hovered your cursor over it. Click on the participant icon, you'll be able to see the full set of participants. And it will also give you the ability to raise your hand. There's an icon for raise your hand, which will be useful when we get to the discussion. Also at the bottom of the screen, you can click on the chat icon and type in any comments you have, and I will be moderating that during the session, which will last 1 hour. So the speakers, each of the speakers will speak about 5 minutes, and then we will have discussions after that. By the way, although the 4 speakers come from 2 universities, Monash and Cornell, this arises from the fact that they are collaborators on a book, a very successful book, which will soon be in its 7th edition, on international and comparative employment relations. I think Greg's slide has the full title at the end, Greg being one of the overall editors of that book. So they will be covering, and we'll start in Northeast Asia with Fang Cooke, who's going to be doing China. We'll move down to Australia, and then we'll go westwards. Ginny will be covering mainly Germany, but some of Europe. And then Harry, I say, will be our cleanup batter, discussing the United States and perhaps commenting on how we stand up compared to some other countries. So without further ado and taking up any more time, let me turn it over to Fang.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to contribute to this session. So I will just go straight into the content. Joe, please, next slide. Yeah, thanks. So briefly, to talk about the context of industrial relations in China, just to give the context for the COVID-19 response. In China, the state continues to play a very influential role in shaping the industrial relations landscape, especially via its agencies at all levels, mainly the local governments and the trade union organizations. And in China, there is only one trade union that is officially recognized by the government, that is the All China Federation of Trade Union, and all the other trade unions are not officially recognized. And ACFTU has to be operating under the leadership of the Communist Party, as all other NGOs should do as well in China. Then also ACFTU has no right to organize strikes or industrial actions, unlike Australia and other countries. But ACFTU has is expected to participate in dispute resolution between workers and the employers, but mainly playing the mediator and mediation role rather than defending workers on one side. They may defend workers as well, but it has to be kind of more neutral. Then also, there is a trend of the Chinese government to dismantle the collective labor dispute and making them into more individual labor dispute to resolve. And this is partly to kind of try to create a harmonious society by not having too much collective dispute. Then in China, over 60% of the workforce are in the non-standard employment, and a large proportion of them are rural migrant workers, and they are largely unorganized and with very little collective bargaining power because they are semi-skilled. Then the impact of COVID-19 on employment and business response. The kind of impact is quite universal to other countries as well, like laying off workers because they have to shut the business down, or standing down workers, and also have reduced working hours as well. Then during the period of time of COVID-19 and the lockdown period, some businesses have had significant reduction of businesses, but other businesses have a surge of demand, such as the couriers, takeaway, delivery. So therefore, those businesses have who have to lay off worker or standing workers down, started to second their workers to other businesses that demand a lot of workers. So that create a kind of outsourcing or temporary outsourcing, but also create a kind of situation where there will be labor disputes because it's very unclear where the employer's responsibilities are, because there's a tripartite, kind of triangular relationship there, employment relationship. Then the continuing pressure for this year, at least, will be how to find employment for the 50 million rural migrant workers, and more so for the 8.7 million university graduates who will need to find jobs in 2020. It is a little bit easier for migrant workers because they just go home, but for the university graduates, that's a big problem. So institutional responses for the government, there are 6 stabilizing targets, but the main target for stabilizing is to stabilize employment as the top priority in the post-COVID-19 recovery. But in general, there is a kind of top-down policy enforcement by the government and to be implemented by the local government and other state-controlled institutional actors. Normally, they are the lower-level state agencies. At the moment, the Chinese government is kind of encouraging or promoting the informal economy or informal employment, such as allowing people to be the peddlers. So there are a lot of carpool sales and on the floor sale at the moment in China, especially since the last week. From the trade unions perspective, I have actually not seen much action or reaction from them, certainly not from the newspapers in China or the social media report. They seem to have kept quite low profile. They have no collective bargaining, no industrial action certainly, and no pushing for legislation yet. I haven't seen any of those activities going on. And also the local ACFTU organizations, their main role has been, if anything, so far has been trying to facilitate workers who are laid off or rural migrant workers to develop some training and to develop the skills to prepare for the employment when the economy rises up again. Then there are major challenges to industrial relations, mainly in the kind of labor dispute area. So the local government had issued policy regulations in order to protect employment. And the local government level, various governments have promoted different types of policies, and none of them, or some of them, are not very well thought through or thought out. But main thing is to protect the employment and extending the leave period. But then the business foots the bill, pays the wages, and they're not allowed to lay off workers, or they're not allowed to dismiss workers so readily. So therefore, it creates a lot of some of the disputes in terms of how to dismiss workers when they're allowed to be dismissed. And also there are issues related to sick leave determination, what can be classified as paid sick leave, and the entitlement and level of compensation. And also working time. When people are told or forced to stay at home and not return to work, or when they are in isolation, all these issues, whether it can be classified as working time or not, is very kind of debatable. in addition to that is the overtime payment. Businesses cannot afford to pay statutory rate when workers now return to work and they want to rush through some of the business orders or they want to catch up to make up some of the lost production. And so that creates a kind of another problem as well in terms of paying overtime because businesses are already drained financially. So in short, the COVID-19 constitutes a kind of force majeure event. And how should employers and workers defend their rights? And that is kind of everybody's thinking about. And
Fang, could I, in light of the time, might I say that perhaps we can, I could stop you there, but we can flip through the slides. And if we have time, we'll come back. Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
Joel, can you flip through the rest of the slides just so people could look at it? Okay, that was
slide.
it. Oh, that was the last slide. Well, go ahead then. Do the last slide.
Okay. Yeah, so the future prospect for the employment and II in China is that COVID-19 has led to the strengthening of the state control, which will continue for some time. And there is strong signs of that continuing. Manufacturing sector definitely has been very hit very hard because of the disruption of the global value supply chain and the reduction of the domestic spending as well. And informal employment and gig economy is now on the rise big time. And that is the way the government wants to go to create employment to keep people afloat. And employers are also now considering spending more money to have production automation and digitalization of the business process. So I will stop it there.
Great, thank you. That was a short time, a big summary. Can we now move to Greg Bamber in Australia?
Thank you very much, Janice and Joel and LERA for organising this session. Australia is sometimes called the lucky country and it can have alternate meanings. I'm going to use it today in a favourable sense. It's a large continent, similar in size to the continental United States, and has a government system which is inspired to some extent by Washington, DC, as well as by Westminster in London. And it's a liberal market economy, a federation of states, and the states jealously guard their rights. The states run public hospitals and schools. And next slide, on employment relations, there's a strong tradition in Australia of mateship and notions of having a fair go. It's been highly unionised at least until the 1970s, with more than 50% of the working population represented in unions, but that's fallen a great deal now to less than 15%, although unions are much stronger in some sectors. The regulatory institutions have the notion of fair work in their titles, like the Fair Work Commission. Australia has universal health care, a relatively high national minimum wage, and legislated protection against unfair dismissal and unfair discrimination. Now focusing on COVID-19, the Prime Minister of Australia is an ideological soulmate of Donald Trump. He talks about the importance of having small government. And when the pandemic first became evident in Australia, he was hesitant to take action. But his very bad management of the recent bushfire crisis, when he disappeared on a secret holiday with his family to Hawaii at the height of the crisis, and then was discovered on Waikiki Beach by a journalist, which spurred him to come back immediately to Australia. The embarrassment of that bad management suddenly spurred him into action when the academic community were beginning to predict a healthcare and an economic crisis following this pandemic. He established a so-called wartime national cabinet, including not only the federal leaders like himself, but also the state leaders, which is unprecedented, certainly in peacetime in Australia. And at least half of these states are led by people from the opposing political party. ScoMo himself comes from the centre-right, he would say, but half of the states are led by leaders from the Labour Party, the ideological opponent of the right-wing Conservative government. Nevertheless, this national cabinet appears to have been working very well to manage this crisis. It immediately moved into introducing a lockdown, stay at home, working from home where possible, banning travel, and closing borders. Not only national borders, but most of the states closed their state borders and introduced quarantine arrangements. And although many people have been calling for free childcare to be provided in Australia for a long time, ScoMo had been resisting this and his colleagues for years. Suddenly we had free childcare introduced along with COVID-19. And the Fair Work Commission and some employers and unions tried to vary the awards and the enterprise bargaining agreements to try and introduce short-term working or cuts in pay in order to minimize the number of layoffs. Moving on to the next slide, Joel. Government assistance took several forms. Just to summarize some of them, JobKeeper payments were introduced for those who were furloughed, and these were paid through employers and the tax system to people who were having to stay at home through having no work. But there were unfortunate gaps in this. It was not a comprehensive system, so casual and many migrant workers were excluded. Job seeker, the unemployment benefits were doubled after the initiation, the start of the pandemic, even though the government had been resisting calls for many years to increase unemployment benefits. A job maker scheme was set up, really introducing Keynesian style policies, almost New Deal-like, to stimulate the economy, even though this government had resisted such moves in the past. Australia's been lucky in having had no recession for 3 decades, but COVID-19 has just tipped Australia into recession, although it's had a smaller contraction to its economy than many other economies. And now it's starting to ease the lockdown regime and return to some kind of new normal. And we've been lucky so far in having only just about 100 deaths from COVID-19. The concluding comments here are trying to draw some lessons from this crisis. And to what extent are we seeing a change from a very conflictual national context for industrial relations? This government and its leadership had never even spoken to the leaders of the trade union movement in Australia until COVID-19 began. And then the Prime Minister invited the leader of the Australian Council of Trade Unions to the Australian equivalent of the White House, where the Prime Minister has his official home, and began a dialogue with her about how the unions can work together with the government and the employers to alleviate the crisis. This was unprecedented from this particular style of government, which had been on a collision course in gridlock with the unions, trying to introduce anti-union laws and inquiries to attack the unions and attack the states, especially those led by left of centre governments. So now the government, just in the last week or so, has said it will introduce a dialogue with the social partners to try and develop a new form of social compact to agree on labour law reform, which is a very interesting development, especially if it continues. I don't know if it will continue for very long, because the government and the employers have a rather different agenda to introduce what they see as more flexible workplaces, and that's code for making it easier to fire workers. whereas the workers and their unions want to seek more job security. But both parties are, and now the last slide, I think, Joel, both parties are united in trying to defeat this common enemy, the COVID-19 pandemic, and also to create jobs and to minimize unemployment. So some employers are following suit and adopting quasi-integrative, quasi-democratic approaches to deciding how the cuts in pay and conditions and jobs will take place, especially in workplaces that are highly unionized, whereas other employers are adopting more distributive, authoritarian, top-down approaches. And these differences give us a very interesting opportunity as researchers and those of us observing the field to conduct more research, which perhaps we'll come and discuss at a future meeting of LERA. So thank you very much, and happy to discuss any of these developments.
Thank you, Greg. And now we turn to Ginny, who has the enviable task of trying to cover Europe, but I think focusing on Germany in a few minutes. Ginny?
Thank you, Janice, and thank you for inviting me to participate. I was invited yesterday morning because Martin Behrens had a back injury. So, and I want to also qualify my comments by saying I'm not currently based in Europe. As you know, I'm in the US, even though I am a British citizen after living there for 10 years. So I've been following policy responses to COVID-19 from a distance, and I know there are some Europeans in the audience. So I invite you to participate in answering any questions about European responses to COVID-19 as well. I'm going to mostly talk about Germany, as Janice says, but with some comparisons to other countries very briefly. So because I have 5 minutes, I'm going to just give a brief background on Germany and then focus on short-time work policies, because that has gotten the most attention, and also it's been the focus of collective bargaining and industrial relations, particularly at the industry level in Germany. So one important bit of background is that many European countries, and certainly Germany, have a stronger social safety net than the US. So this includes rights to sick leave and universal health insurance. For example, German employees have a legal right to 6 weeks of sick leave at full pay. So the government, as it's passing different policies to respond to COVID-19, can basically build those on top of an existing functional social safety net, which I think makes a big difference in comparison to the US. So they recently passed something called an Infektionsschutzgesetz, gotta love the long German words, infection protection law, which subsidizes employers' cost of sick leave connected to COVID-19. So it's like a subsidy for something that employers would usually pay anyway. A second important bit of background is just on the German industrial relations system. For the Americans in the audience who don't know Germany so well, there are basically, I think, 2 parts of the system that are particularly important in being deployed to navigate the crisis. One is sectoral or industry-wide collective bargaining between employers' associations representing multiple employers and unions representing workers at multiple workplaces and firms. Another tool is, and I'll talk about that with short-time work because that's been particularly important in negotiating agreements on top of national policies. And then another tool is works councils, and these are elected by the workforce and they're separate from unions. And Germany is famous for having really strong co-determination rights in a lot of areas, including over measures to protect employee health. And this basically means that the works councils have to agree before an employer can go ahead with COVID-19 policies where you have a works council in place. So for example, at VW, works councils agreed on 100 different health and safety measures, and they then helped make sure they were in place before the workers returned after a 5-week break. And that had implications across VW's supply chain because it shared those 100 health and safety measures with thousands and thousands of suppliers, which then also had to follow them when they were coming in and out of factories. So the Works Council presence in some of those large firms can have reverberations in Germany across and outside of places where Works Councils are strong. However, there's a caveat that there are large parts of the labor market in Germany that fall outside of those agreements. The coverage of these traditional institutions has shrunk over time. So particularly subcontractors, self-employed small businesses are increasingly not covered by works councils and unions. Sectoral bargaining right now covers around 45% of all employees, and works councils around 40%. So although it's still, a substantial chunk of the workforce and certainly large companies, it's a minority within Germany. So now to turn to Kurzarbeit, or short-time work. You may have read about this. It's been covered in the US press and compared to the US unemployment system and the stimulus package in the US, which was passed and has been seen as perhaps not as effective as short-time work. This was widely used during the 2008-2009 financial crisis, so a lot of companies already had experience using it. It's often cited as one of the reasons Germany recovered so quickly. So in brief, how does it work? Companies can either send their workers home or significantly reduce their hours without having to lay them off. So employers receive Kurzarbeitergeld, or short-time work money, from the Federal Employment Agency. And they then use that to pay employees what now is 60% of their former salary. It's a bit more if you have children. And there was a recent agreement to increase the subsidy to 70% of pay from the 4th month, and then 80% of pay from the 7th month that a worker has been on this program. And this was something that was strongly pushed by the unions, and they really are claiming credit for getting that increase in short-time work at the national level. The latest statistics I saw, there's something like 8 to 10 million German workers on short-time work, and this program has kept unemployment down to around 6.1% in May in Germany, and that's compared to close to 20% in the US. Harry can confirm that in his presentation, I'm sure. So other European countries have these kinds of programs too, but there has been some criticism within Germany around the overall lower percent of pay covered. So for example, in the Netherlands and Denmark, short-time work policies cover 100% of pay. And Søren here, I noticed from Denmark, can talk about Denmark's excellent system, which I think was negotiated at the national level through a collective agreement with employers and unions. And Germany is unusual and certainly different from Denmark in that industry level agreements have been really important in improving these short-time work payments. So for example, the metalworking agreement gives workers up to 97% of pay when they're on short-time work. And the agreement, there's even agreement for fast food restaurants, which covers 90% of pay. There are a lot of other sectoral agreements at different levels, and also company level agreements like Deutsche Telekom. But as said before, these agreements are covering now a minority of German workers. So there are a lot of groups that are falling outside of those protections. So for example, Germany has a large low-wage slaughterhouse industry. And there were reports of hundreds of largely migrant workers getting infected with COVID-19 due to poor conditions. A lot of them are living together in close quarters in this short-term accommodation. And so that has shown a light on these particular segments of the US labor market that are outside of protections. Lufthansa gave its own furloughed workers 90% of their normal net pay, but workers for a lot of its subcontractors or joint ventures were getting much lower rates because they were covered by different agreements or not at all. So in conclusion, Germany has built on a past set of policies to protect employment and worker health. Unions and employers have played an important role. However, there are these two different Germanys in the crisis, and there's a lot of debate right now within Germany how to really ensure a safety net for those who are already more precarious. I have pages and pages of notes on all the different specific labor market policies in Germany that do try to bridge these gaps. So I could maybe answer some questions about that during the question and answer. I have to say there's constant change in this area. The German economy is now opening. And yesterday, the government agreed on 130 billion euro Konjunkturpaket, this new stimulus program that has a lot of different provisions for supporting alternative energy and investment in different areas. So we can discuss this during question and answer time.
Great, thank you very much, Ginny. And now Harry, to clean up, tell us about the United States in comparison.
Thanks, Janice. I want to thank Janice and Joel for their work in organizing the session, and of course, Emily and Bernadette. It's sort of hard to describe the United States in part because of the incredible diversity within our system. And I'll try, as I give kind of overview accounts, to also highlight that diversity. The first thing is to note, as you probably already are aware, whether you live in the United States or elsewhere, there has been a devastating impact in the U.S. labor market because of the pandemic, in part because of the devastating impact of the pandemic on the health of Americans, more than 100,000 deaths. As Ginny mentioned, the unemployment rate, though posted in May for April, was 15%. The unemployment rate officially is going to be announced tomorrow for May. It's expected to be about 20%. That, as Erica Grosjean knows well, that's just the official rate. It's believed the unofficial unemployment is probably on the order of about 25% for the workforce, which compares to levels within the Great Depression and came on much more quickly than the Great Depression. A noteworthy fact is the uneven impact of a lot of things being so uneven in the United States. A lot of the unemployment is concentrated among low wage and lower skilled and lower income workers. One statistic that was widely discussed is that there was a survey done showing that 40% of the unemployment in May was among people who were earning $40,000 or less when they had worked. Some of this uneven impact is because of the sectoral impact of the pandemic. In particular, the hospitality sector, restaurants and hotels have been devastated, and there are many low and modest income workers in that sector. In addition, as I'm sure is true in other countries as well, because of the spread of the internet, white-collar workers are more able to continue working, and they tend to be, on average, of somewhat higher income. Well, now on to the main focus of my quick comments about collective action responses to these devastating impacts. Overall, I return to simple notions about bargaining power to recognize that labor has very little bargaining power in the current labor market situation. Both total power, total income, and profits is very low, and then relative power is particularly low. At the same time, labor has been trying various strategies, and I'll mention quickly some of those. One key effort by labor, which is like a lot of the things labor is doing now, it's hard to see, and that's their impact as a lobbyist. Labor has impacted federal policy action, state action, and local action. They lobbied hard against tax cuts, and they've also lobbied for targeted relief for airlines and certain sectors where labor has been strongly affected and all. As well, labor's impact is at the company and local level, and the initial impact being trying largely unsuccessfully to get enhanced severance payments, but more importantly to focus on the health and safety of employees who have continued to work as so-called essential workers. One would argue all workers are essential, but there are industries where work has continued, and there's been a lot of effort by unions. Hard to see, but there, when you read closely and hear from many valuable journalists, Steve Greenhouse and others who are going into those sites and talking to the activists, labor lobbies hard about the health and safety conditions where work has continued, and is now lobbying even harder as there's elements of a restart to the health and safety conditions of workers as they return. You can hear that through actions of the UAW and the auto plants, actions of United Food and Commercial Workers in retail, and also in the food processing plants, actions by the unions representing nurses in their healthcare and safety and other healthcare workers. Overall, my own sense is that, again, a lot of the action is informal. It's hard to see, but it's there, it's important. But it's also action, as a number of the press has highlighted, that it often takes shape now through collective actions that don't involve unions or collective bargaining. You hear that about employees at Amazon. The press loves to cover protests at Amazon, but you can imagine there are many protests occurring at firms less well known as Amazon that are somewhat similar, employees taking collective action, protesting health and safety conditions, or in some cases protesting the inadequacy of income support during layoffs. Let me just kind of summarize on the policy front again very quickly. The federal government, as was mentioned, and as you probably know, passed an important piece of legislation called the CARES Act. I think what was noteworthy about that act, it included a $600 a week a grant to those getting unemployment insurance that's added on top of the state unemployment insurance. Again, characteristic of the United States, enormous variation in the level of state UI. But that was an important infusion of disposable income into the U.S. economy. As well, there's a lot of state and local variation, again, in part because of the U.S. tradition of federalism, in part because paralysis of policy at the federal level, and in part because the inclination of the Trump administration to either deny the effects of the pandemic or to be very passive in trying to create responses. Again, where there's been union action, it's often informal, but I think it's harder to see, it's been important. Overall, my own sense is there's something, I don't want to exaggerate this, but there's something of a leftward drift in the policy response. We never had that level of federal grants, as I understand it, to the unemployment insurance system. $600 a week on to the end of July is meaningful. We'll see what comes next. There's another supplemental bill, sort of a CARES Act 2, being debated. Initially, my sense is that there was a strong Keynesian response, in part because the innovation and policy was coming from the Democrats in the House of Representatives, key role played by Nancy Pelosi. As well, we saw even a Keynesian attitude by the chair of the Federal Reserve Bank. In the past, we often, certainly that's what President Obama and his administration faced with deficit hawks from Republicans and even some Wall Street Democrats worried about the deficit, trying to hold back the extent of federal income support. Initially, we had more of a Keynesian response. We've begun to hear deficit hawk discussion in the debates about CARES Act 2, and so it remains to be seen whether that Keynesian tone continues, but I still think it's noteworthy that it happened and that it included those federal grants to UI and included the less substantial, but I think still meaningful, some policy on temporary in nature on parental leave. Again, as you know, as Greg had pointed out, the U.S. has no national policy in contrast to virtually all other civilized countries and all. The last thing I'll say is just, again, a very patchwork, both impact in the United States, very uneven, patchwork policy response. Many people, I don't know if I emphasize this, many people are not covered by the unemployment insurance system and suffer greatly. It's somewhat typical in the United States to have such patchwork response, but I think that's even escalating further given the paralysis of policy at the federal level and the fact that there's some state and local actions that are more aggressive and more responsive to the leftward drift within some of our policy debate. I'll stop at that. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Harry. I was going to say open it up for discussion, but we have various questions that have been put forward through chat, and what I'm going to try to do is group them together so we have some efficiency and time here. Several of them, Bob Chiaravalli and others, were asking questions about the German system. So Ginny, I mean, I think one of the main issues here is trying to understand how changes in working time use the word reforms, are handled. Is it by works councils or by unions, which is a little complicated because you have to know German law. And I'll just throw one thing in here. I'll make a law comment. Wages are determined through collective bargaining. And as Ginny said, they're sectoral, but other changes within the workplace are usually done by works councils. So I'll turn it over to Ginny. Maybe she can give some examples or discuss that more broadly.
Okay, thanks, Janice. So one comment is just in response to what Janice said. Yes, wages are determined through collective bargaining, and but I say there are a lot of areas where there's kind of a mix between the two. And certainly homeworking, though, would be an area for the Works Council to get involved. So under German employment law, the Works Council has to always be involved in the planning and execution of homeworking. That's one of the areas. So basically where you have a Works Council in place, you have to have a collective or agreement, what's called a Betriebsvereinbarung, or works agreement, with your Works Council on how that will be carried out. I don't have a lot of examples because I haven't been in Germany right now, but I'm fairly sure that Verdi, who I've studied a lot in the past at Deutsche Telekom, has done a lot of work with them on organizing different homeworking arrangements. I work with the CWA in the US, and they, in March, started negotiating agreements with their employers, with Verizon and others here, on homeworking arrangements for the workers, basically giving employees the right to work from home in their call centers, which were deemed a sort of essential service. Another detail about this is that the Social Democratic Minister of Labor Affairs and Social Affairs in Germany did propose enshrining the right to homeworking in law recently. And so this was this is a reform of labor market legislation the German Trade Union Confederation's been advocating for over the last 2 years. So this is seen by the German labor movement as maybe an opportunity to get that right, more as a legal right that would be then enforced across employers, but right now it is not.
Great, thank you. There are several questions about Fang's presentation, and Fang herself has responded to some of these by, if you go through the chat, you'll see references to books or an article that answer them. But I think one of the big issues here, Fang, something you said, as you mentioned, there were collective labor disputes for being, you didn't say suppressed, I will say suppressed by the government generally recently in favor of social harmony, but there are individual disputes. And so I think there was some question here about how the alternative dispute, well, it's not alternative, the labor, there is a formal method for handling the individual disputes, and the individual disputes in some ways can be reflective of a more general concern. So maybe you'd like to address that.
So right now in China, the labor dispute related to COVID-19 has been kind of channeled to the court and sometimes to the government. So there are two routes at least to resolve the labor dispute. One is through the labor authority in the government, and the other, and that can be more quickly. And so that is the administrative process. And the other route is to go through the court. And so we have mediation, arbitration, and litigation. So three routes. So right now it is not really very collective in a sense. In the past, before the COVID-19, even if there are collective disputes like strikes, when the workers get dismissed and they all go to the court, and the court will treat them as individual cases rather than one collective case. There are still some collective cases, but the tendency is to kind of dismantle the collective case to make it more individual. So that's the situation.
Great, thank you. This is for Greg. I'm going to make Greg be even broader. Greg, when you were commenting on the idea of a national cabinet in this in a health emergency situation where federal and state leaders are brought together, and what that's led to, quite obviously, as we all know, that's incredibly different than the approach in the United States with the president. As far as I know, the president hasn't talked to any officially, like in any around the table conversation with union officers, and his conversation on a conference call with governors didn't go well. So, but you know the UK also. So I would like to ask why you thought, what happened that persuaded your center-right prime minister to do this?
Thanks, Janice. I think one factor, as I mentioned, was his bad handling of the bushfires crisis, which saw him having won an election only 6 months earlier, a miracle election as he called it, because everyone was expecting the Labour Party to win, but he just snuck through, and then badly handling that bushfire crisis, and then initially kind of denying the pandemic when we were just starting to move into lockdown. He said, well, I'm going to my football team to support them this weekend, and I encourage everyone else to go to the football, when we were just being told to start working from home. And that was a really bad call. And then academic colleagues made forecasts about how things were going to be disastrous in Australia unless we took drastic action very quickly. And that seemed to jolt him into a complete about face, or a U-turn, if you like, from the course that he had been following, in terms of he'd been deriding, and his colleagues deriding, Keynesian style policies and interventionist policies and notions of big government, and then suddenly turned around and as Harry was saying about some of the developments in the US, really government has stepped in to try and rescue the situation with providing economic support, financial support, and enforcing kind of lockdown arrangements. So that maybe was what was jolting him to make a change. And forgive me for saying so, but maybe looking across at the United States, and I see someone's asking a question to what extent people look to the United States. And obviously everyone looks to the United States as being the world's great superpower, and where there's wonderful medical research going on, and we're hoping that the Americans, if no one else comes up with a vaccine to immunize people against this pandemic, it's more likely to come out of the United States than anywhere else. But I don't think Australians were looking to the United States or the UK for that matter as a model in how to manage this crisis. They were looking perhaps more at the way there had been innovative policies adopted in some other smaller countries, perhaps Taiwan, perhaps Singapore, perhaps New Zealand, which has done even better than Australia in the way it's managed the pandemic.
Thanks. I want to go back to Harry. Harry, I think many people in the poll listening would agree with your observation that perhaps some of the more interesting developments have been at state and local level in, and I was thinking responding to unemployment and need for income support, sick pay, all that sort of thing. So the question is, do you think that some of the activism we have seen at local level during the past couple of months, plus the realization by some people that they don't have any rights to fall back on, and let me expand on that, because I'm going to get to Jim Brudney's question about hazard pay. I had a call yesterday from a journalist about hazard pay, and I said, there is no requirement whatsoever for hazard pay in the United States, and there's not even a definition of it. The only thing that the Department of Labor says, well, if you get hazard pay, it's part of your wage rate, and therefore, for Fair Labor Standards Act, it is it's subject to time and a half if you go overtime. So many people, and this was at Whole Foods, by the way, raising this issue in Philadelphia, because they've just been told that their hazard pay is stopping. So do you think that this realization, I don't have rights, I could be in a very vulnerable position, is striking a larger segment of workers in the United States, and particularly in cities, et cetera, and that they'll have any lasting effect?
Maybe. I mean, to be honest, I think the November election is going to be incredibly important, and I'm always reminded that a lot of the policy invention, creation, innovation in the United States start at the state level. That was true historically with the development of unemployment insurance and other New Deal elements that appeared in Wisconsin and some other states. And you could imagine that if there is a really strong swing left in the November election, not just the removal of President Trump. We can all be praying for that, but also a potential Democratic majority in the Senate and the House, that people will turn to look at the innovation that's occurring. In some ways, the United States is an example of the best of things occurring and the worst of things occurring. And that somewhere in the United States, you can find, absolutely terrific things happening. The unfortunate thing is you can find more broadly many horrible things happening. And, I do think it's possible people will be so as frustrated at their workplace experience. Jim Rodney ably pointed out that what also has mattered is the administration of policy, and a critical entity now, given the elevation and concern of health and safety, is OSHA. And of course, there's been general passivity on the part of the OSHA administration under the Trump administration at the federal level. Some more better action in certain states. And it's possible that, as well as just sort of other more widespread disillusionment with kind of market-oriented or neoliberal policy, will lead to, a wave of strong national action if things change in November. I just think that's going to determine where a lot of this goes. There'll be continuing bubbling of action if for some reason Trump is reelected and the Senate stays Republican. I think you'll still see continuing action occurring at state and local levels, but it just needs, for it to coalesce into more widespread policy, we need a change in the administration and national political makeup.
Right. Jim's question, by the way, and this is a factual issue, this was, as Harry just mentioned, that in the United States, neither the Centers for Disease Control or OSHA, particularly OSHA, have not issued any emergency temporary regulation regarding mandatory standards on safety and health at workplaces during this pandemic, nor hazard pay for essential workers who must be on the front lines. He was wondering whether any of the countries that you covered or any you know of whether public authorities have issued any temporary regulations. Ginny mentioned that there was a problem in Germany with people working in slaughterhouses, but I was wondering if any country has responded. Hearing nothing, I would assume that there is not. And I have one question, and I'm going to do this in 1 minute. In Germany, you mentioned, and this is true in many places, that large employers may take a policy of saying we're going to keep our employees on the books and we'll pay them a certain amount, but smaller, like subcontractors, etc., wouldn't be covered by that policy or the sectoral agreement, perhaps. I was just wondering, from the viewpoint of, to have large employers, their policies, not just trickle down, but has it raised workers' expectation that their small employers should do the same thing? Or are they just accepting, I work for a small employer and it's hopeless, they're cheap?
Well, the small employers are covered by the national regulations, right? So they can also take advantage of short-time work and put employees on the furloughed. So it can be up to, you take all of your employees and they're getting 60% of their pay paid for by the government, right, under the current rules. The problem is that if 60% of your pay is already minimum wage, and for a longer period of time, you got to wait until the 4 months kick in with a higher rate. That's hitting particular groups of workers particularly hard, and it's exacerbating inequalities because you have the metal workers with their 95% agreement and they're at the sectoral level continuing to get their already higher pay, and you have some service sector agreements that are also keeping wages up, but then you have other workers who are just getting the statutory amount. You also have a lot of policies that are targeted to, they've done a lot of things around extending these to mini jobs, making sure that temporary workers get some coverage. So there have been a lot of adjustments to try to cover workers. I was reading an article about a subsidy of 4,500 euros for 3 months for Selbstständige, like self-employed workers or employees running their own business. So there are policies like that that are that are filling in the gaps. I think this is always a hard thing about talking about Germany. Germans see the gaps and the problems, maybe in comparison to some other countries. It still looks pretty good. But yeah.
We're coming close to the end of the hour, so I'll just make one quick, I should ask you all for comments, but we would never get through. I'll just make one comment. But, the one thing we haven't mentioned for the United States, and I think this is looming, is that we know many people don't have health insurance through their employer, but those that do, if they're on layoff, we're probably coming to the time of the year where employers will say, oh, June 30th is coming up, and I just can't afford to pay the health insurance premium for those who are on layoff. So I think we might have a bigger crisis in this country than other countries where there is some form of universal health insurance or some form of provision of health service. Let me finish with Greg. Greg was so helpful in organizing this. I should give him great credit. So Greg, listening to everything you've heard today, I think you always in these things say, oh, we only had 1 hour and there's something that I think was left unsaid, or maybe people didn't understand someone's comment. So I'll give it to Greg. I mean, what do you think that to talk about this comparative view, something that maybe we should say to?
Well, thanks, Janice. And I guess my immediate reflection is just to go back to the question you put to me a moment ago about why the Australian Conservatives, the sort of mini Trumps, are trying to adopt a more cooperative approach. And traditionally in Australia, it's been the Labor Party that has had the reputation of working well with the unions in a cooperative way and also championing our public health system. But in some ways it might be seen as a clever tactic by the Conservatives now to steal the clothes, in a sense, of the Labor Party and trying to marginalise the Labor Party at a national level by showing that the Conservatives, rather than smashing up the unions, can achieve more by working harmoniously with working people and the unions that represent them as a way out of this crisis in a more integrative way. So I guess a closing comment might be that the work that Joel, along with Walton and McKersey, did about analysing different kinds of bargaining relationships really has perennial relevance in terms of being able to apply that analytical framework to lots of different situations, including this situation in different countries and different industries. And as Harry was saying, there's so much experimentation going on in the US at the local level and at federal level, and the same is true in Germany and China as well. So I think applying an analytical framework always helps us to try and make sense of the great variety of patterns that we see in different parts of the world. And that's what Ginny and Fang and Chris Wright and I are trying to do as we're wrapping up the 7th edition of our book on international and comparative employment relations. But we've been to some extent thrown on the back foot trying to make sense of this COVID-19 crisis, just as we're putting the finishing touches on the manuscript. So
Great, thank you very much.
And Joel and Emily and Bernadette and everyone for participating today. Thank you.
Right, and let me thank our panelists. It was really wonderful, and our participants for staying with us. Finally, some of you asked about the recording. This was being recorded, and if you go to the message that was sent out by LERA this morning that you may have clicked on to join, there is the place where you can click to see how you can get the recording of this, but also the other webinars that have been done and whatever else is still on tap. Thank you very much to everyone. And bye now.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks,
Well
Janice.
done.